Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. Xavier here. Talking a little bit, doing a little portfolio update for basically the end of the month in terms of dividends for this portfolio. So we've got about almost 29, almost 29 into the portfolio. Currently, for the dividends, we've hit another 90, was 93 for the month. Our biggest dividends, of course, coming in from Ladder Capital, Iron Mountain. We had two smaller dividends from Bank of Nova Scotia, as well as for Simon Property. A little bit from O, and then of course a little bit from Maine, and of course Coca-Cola. I don't think I'm going to get another one from Gain this month. Even if I did, it's not going to be that big anyway. But basically, it's in terms of the dividends for the month. We're working our way closer to the $100 mark. I'm sure by the end of the year, I want to hit my 115. Probably a little bit higher. It's because most of these dividends had paid out prior to basically me buying a lot of these stocks. Some of the losses, of course, coming in typically with the sell-off. Looking back at the market, we've seen a lot of sell volume coming in, and as a result, the market's going to fall. It's just as the volume starts to increase, and there's basically, it kind of feels like the buyers have basically sitting out on the sidelines, and so as a result, of course, the market is seeing quite a bit of a pullback of about, we're looking at like what, 10% so far, and that's okay. The only thing that I really wanted to talk about was basically the push through to two different supports. We blew through 28, and then we also surpassed what looked like at about just at about 20. We saw it here at 27k, about 27.5. We saw the exact same thing right about here, about 27.2, where the market blew through. Back at the chart, as you can see right here, the market basically had a hard time breaking above 27.2. We saw a retest that was way back here in December of 2019. We see that exact same area of resistance get gapped down through with a retest to the upside, and then finally the market worked its way back down. This is, of course, is during the decline at the beginning, at the height of course, the pandemic. We saw a resurgence, a retest right here, and then we saw the exact same thing right here. And then so we see a breakdown through the area of support. We saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different trading days where we basically held at about 26, about 26.7, which was just around where the market had been trading here for several trading days, and as well as here. My only issue is, one, the increasing volume that we're seeing to the sell side. Two, the market closed below the support. So we see during the day we were above the support, and then at the end of the day we closed below the support. So what could happen if we still see the increasing volume to the downside? What could happen is the market could subsequently retest that 27.2 and then roll to the downside. Your next area of support would basically be at about the 26.2, which is where we stopped today. And then, of course, your next basically area where the market could come down to would be about 26 and then 25. More than likely, the market will hit 25. We see a lot of uncertainty related to the market, predominantly related to who is going to come into power, whether it's going to be Biden, who is for higher taxation, who is for higher corporate taxes, who is also for basically shutting down the economy, as he said, if the science agrees. We're seeing in places like in Europe, for example, increasing hospitalizations. At least that is what they're saying, although that is not exactly the case. And from the BBC, hospitalizations jumped nearly 25%. But that really doesn't matter. We want to talk numbers. We want to talk numbers in terms of actual patients in hospitals. I'll leave the link in the description. As you can see, the hospitalizations, despite rising cases, as you can see, hospitalizations are very low, very low by comparison to where they were at the height of the pandemic. The other thing that's important to keep into consideration is the total number of hospital beds that are being utilized for the pandemic. And as you can see, the new admissions mean 3% of hospital beds are now occupied for patients of the pandemic. 3%. And yet we're seeing shutdowns in England. as a nurse, been a nurse for over 8 years now. It doesn't matter whether you have, hundreds of people, tens of thousands, thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands that are people that are, quote unquote, testing positive, if none of these patients make it into the hospital. Because if the hospital doesn't get swarmed and people are not becoming symptomatic, right? That's what matters. People are not becoming symptomatic, then there's no reason to be shutting down all these different countries and states. There is a different sort of motivation for what is going on. We see the exact same thing, for example, in in Utah, excuse me, in Utah, where articles are coming out, the sky is falling in Utah, we're at crisis standards. But when you actually look at the data, as you can see, the number of ICU beds that are dedicated to someone who tested positive. This is also important to understand that this is in relation to people who have tested positive. Testing positive does not mean the person is symptomatic. It also does not mean that the person who came to the hospital for the pandemic. I've had numerous patients who have tested positive, but are completely not in the hospital for anything even respiratory related. Yet those individuals, of course, have tested positive. That is just a reality. A person could test positive because they've got it from someone in the hospital. Maybe someone didn't wear their PPE correctly, or someone didn't do efficient hand washing, and then that patient, of course, tested positive, but they tested positive for, after the fact. With that said, as you can see, despite saying, the daily new cases, of course, are on the rise, they're in the critical, but not in terms of the infection rate. The infection rate has actually been basically stagnant for the past, since April. Literally since April, the infection rate has not changed in Utah. Positivity rate, of course, is going up, and that's just the reality. The more testing you do, the more likely you are to find people. But as you can see, ICU occupation has pretty much remained basically stagnant since July. The other thing that's important to take into consideration is, as you can see, if they were really worried about finding these individuals, right? This is tracers hired, contact tracers. As you can see, the amount of contact tracers that are being hired is actually decreasing. And it's like, well, wait a minute. You're telling me that we're in crisis mode, right? We're in, hospitals are in possible crisis standards, but yet you're not hiring people to basically do contact tracing, right? Two are just not matching up. Right? Two aren't matching up. We're seeing the exact same thing, of course, right? Cases. This is total. This is total cases. Obviously, the total will always continue to go up until basically everybody either gets it. But what we're seeing in terms of deaths, as you can see, deaths are pretty much remaining stagnant, right? Deaths are pretty much remaining stagnant for the most part. Hospitalizations, of course, are going up, but again, these are individuals who just tested positive. We don't know if those individuals are in the hospital because of the virus, as well as the same thing in terms of the ICU. We also don't know the ages of these individuals, which is also important to know. Are these patients who are already at life expectancy, or are these individuals who are young and healthy individuals, which would let people know in society the severity of the disease? And of course, we're not hearing any of that. The other important thing to keep into consideration is, for many countries, we get the flu season late, right? Many countries, as talked about through the Daily Mail, says experts pose the intriguing question as to why there are no influenza cases. Influenza across the globe have nosedived by 98%. In many countries that would be seeing cases in the hundreds and in the thousands, reporting them, of course, to the World Health Organization, many of them are not reporting any cases at all whatsoever, or very few cases that should have hundreds or perhaps thousands of cases reporting on a daily basis, because this is the season. And yet the World Health Organization is saying, oh, what happened to the flu? For the most part, people were so worried about having a flu epidemic, as well as the current pandemic that is on hand. But yet, as you can see, the data is showing otherwise. And so as a result, this is what is being utilized as the new driver of the market to the downsides. But in terms of the data, that isn't the case. And of course, if you actually look at the data in the United States, less than 5% of all hospital beds in America are utilized towards the pandemic currently. Here in New York City, it's under 3%. It's 2.9% of all hospital beds in the state of New York are dedicated to the pandemic, with the amount of restrictions that we have here in New York. In Florida, where Florida is basically open for business, have more cases, right? In New York, there was about 500,000. In Florida has about 780,000, with half the deaths. And of course, they also only have, in terms of hospital bed usage, are still under 3% of all hospital beds in the state of Florida are under 3%. And this is a state that is literally wide open for business with no pandemic restrictions whatsoever. And they're only sitting at roughly 3%. I think it was 2.9, depending upon the day, it fluctuates between like 2.9 and 3%. But again, these are not pandemic levels of hospitalizations. And of course, that's what we were originally taught. And you know, the lockdown was supposed to be to flatten the curve. The curve has long been flattened. But what we are seeing is in still many of these democratic states, like for example, New York, places like California, where basically the economy is basically being driven into the ground, not related to the virus. But these of course are things that are not related to the virus at hand. So this is what is being utilized in the market, maybe to shake people out of the market, whatever it is. It's not related to the data, because the data does not show that, even though that this is what they will state, that investors are worried because of the pandemic. But when you actually take a look at the data does not reflect that. And so you have to ask yourself, well, what's the narrative? Well, realistically speaking, in terms of the stimulus that unfortunately did not get passed, that did not get passed because that bill that Democrats were introducing had a lot of, in terms of bailouts for Democratic states that were being run poorly. And Trump and the Republicans said that we're not going to be bailing out states that are being run poorly. And this is what many of these Democratic governors are basically like. Here, for example, in New York, Cuomo, even though the numbers don't have it, like I said, hospitalizations in New York State are 3%, right? 2.9%. But we see numerous restrictions in place. The economy, in terms of unemployment, New York has the highest unemployment in the entire country, hands down. In places like Bronx and Brooklyn, they are north of 20%. It's 21% in Brooklyn, 25% in the Bronx, 16% here located in New York, 20% out in Queens. In terms of the unemployment rate, we have lost millions upon millions of jobs. And of course, we're not seeing the sort of cases. And of course, Cuomo keeps saying, well, people keep asking him, well, what are you going to do about, basically you've lost all this revenue. Businesses are shut down. And what do they repetitively say? Well, the federal government needs to step in. And of course, as Trump has said, that they're not going to bail out these states who are just running their states into the ground. And that in turn is basically what is driving the market currently. And that will be what continues to drive the market currently, as many of these states keep pushing for federal bailouts. Pelosi had openly stated that they were not going to do, just a single payer bailout for the average person. The average person wasn't going to just get a bailout. Trump was said he was more than willing to send out the $1,200 stimulus just to the average person, but he wasn't looking to bail out all of these states that were poorly run, especially because they've been poorly run for quite some time. And of course, he's basically not looking to make Democratic governors look good, who basically are in opposition to him. It makes absolutely no sense. While it is a political game, the game is primarily being played at the local level, where many of these local states are being run poorly. And as a result, this is basically what is impacting the stock market currently. Not necessarily about the pandemic, but more about how these local politicians will react, and depending upon who comes into power will of course impact the stock market, as I've said before, etc. But realistically speaking, that's basically what most of these Democrats are waiting for. They're waiting to see if Trump is going to come into power. They know they're going to have a hard time with the bailout. Ironically, even both California and New York have said that even if there was going to be some sort of a vaccine, that they would hold from administering said vaccine until they felt that it was good and proper for people to have the vaccine according to their like. So even if it does roll out and it does pass, through the FDA, they said that's not good enough for them, that they will hold on to it. More than likely, like I said, for a political play to basically hold their states hostage and basically trying to push the Republicans for a bailout. We're just gonna have to wait and see next week how that works out. Even after the fact, as there isn't going to be a stimulus, even after, if Trump does get reelected, or even if Biden gets reelected, there isn't going to be a stimulus that, of course, that is somewhat needed, depending upon your opinion. But what really needs to happen is many of these states need to basically go the way of Florida and come back to doing business and putting in minimal restrictions and not being like what's going on in many other countries. That's basically going to be the end for this video. I'll do another recap. Of course, if we see things changing in terms of if we're breaking support and resistances, I will come back, of course, and showcase what the next ones are. But currently, like I said, 26K, if we see a retest to the downside, which it looks like the futures are already showcasing down, that futures currently are showing to the downside. Realistically speaking, a break of 26 will push us down to a break of 25. We'll just have to wait and see what the market has in store. Thanks for watching, and I'll check you out next time.